So let's go through quickly the user interface for SYNTH, as well as some basic principles behind it. The first thing you need to know is that you need to have KitOps installed if you're going to use SYNTH. And you can use KitOps Free or KitOps Pro, it doesn't matter. The only difference is that you can't create your own inserts with KitOps Free, but you can create your own recipes with KitOps Free. And a recipe is just using existing inserts. And for most of us, if you don't know what KitOps is, then you need to check out this link for the KitOps manual. So KitOps SYNTH is installed as an add-on, and you install it pretty much like you do KitOps. You just locate the zip file and install that. And then what you need to do is you need to go unzip the SYNTH master folder and put that somewhere where you know where it is, and then go into KitOps. And in here, you're going to want to load the SYNTH master folder. Here I have it loaded, I have it shown. And you'll just click on this button plus, and you'll identify where it is, where the master folder is. Let's go find it. Here's our SYNTH master folder. Double click on it once, and then double click on any other folder inside it, just like you would do any other KitOps KPAC, and then go up one level. If you see all of these, then you know that you are in the right directory to say accept. I'm not going to do that because I've already got it loaded. So make sure you do that. So you have those two things done, and you're pretty much good to go, because with that master folder loaded, you're going to be able to load up a lot of the different recipes that come with SYNTH. Okay, the next thing you need to know about SYNTH is that SYNTH only works on faces and selected faces. So I can come in here and I can select this face and it'll work on that face. Or I can come in here and let's just say, I'm going to right click and just say subdivide. And then we can see that SYNTH will work on these 4 and then these 2. So it's going to actually create the same recipe on here and on here if we want to, as long as they're not touching. If they're touching, then it's going to look at the bounding box of the overall region and see that as one. And I can also come in here and do this. So it can work on these 4, these 2, and these 4. But if I touch them, I'm going to have a problem because this angle is going to create a problem. So you have to make them non-contiguous, especially if they're changing plane. Okay, now we're back into the non-subdivided cube. I'm going to select this side face as the face that we're going to want to use. So a key thing to remember is that at least one face needs to be selected. So let's look at all of our panels here. So let's go over a quick preview of all of these panels, and then we'll get into more detail. So the first one's the actions panel, and here's where when you press do it, it's going to propagate all of the inserts you've selected. And remember, you need to make sure the object is selected for the do it button to be enabled. We can also clear all the propagations, and then we have this main seed, which we'll talk about a little later, and we can set it to auto update. So anytime you make a change, it automatically propagates. When the preview button is checked, it means that it will not render any of the Boolean modifiers that have been applied to this object. The iterator is a unique tool that allows you to generate any number of renderings based on a seed range. As we talked about earlier, we have a seed up here. Changing that seed is a randomness factor. So by changing the seed range here, it's going to change that master seed and it'll render files to whatever folder you select. So this is a great way for you to look at many different iterations and then come back and apply them. The tools area is pretty straightforward. These are tools that you're going to use after you completed your object and you're ready to move on to more modeling. Layers are like Photoshop layers, except they render from the top down. Every layer that you add has its own set of inserts, its own placement style, its own transformation, and its own optimizations. So that's the key thing about layers. You can add as many of them as you want to. You can enable and disable them, and there's a lot of other things you can do that we'll get to. Inserts is pretty much the same kind of interface that you're used to over on KitOps, where you can just select an insert and then you add the insert. And in the case of SYNTH, you just enable an insert, and then you can choose the KPAC you want to access, and you can then choose the insert from the KPAC. You have 7 of these that you can set up and use one or all 7. Again, these relate specifically to the selected layer. So for instance, if I go in here and choose this, and I select here, I'm going to have a completely different set of inserts for this layer. Placement style is exactly that. You can place things in rows, in columns, in a grid. You can place things around the edge of your selection, and you can randomly place inserts. So this is how we're going to place the inserts. Notice placement style has a seed value too. We call this the layer seed value. So versus this, which is the main seed value. So you can actually adjust on a layer by layer basis the randomness by using the seed value. Each one of these has their own set of features that we'll go over in a little bit. Transformation just allows you to move the inserts around. You can adjust the seed position. You can scale it in X, Y, and Z. You can rotate it, and you can rotate offset. So for instance, if it rotate offset is kind of a cool thing where you can actually put 90 in there and the insert will just rotate by 90 degrees every so often. So it's again tied into the seed value. Optimizations is real important. If you're using 2.91, which you should be, you have the option of using the exact booleans or the fast booleans, and that's important to be aware of. And then once you finish creating your recipe or you want to load a recipe, you use this button to load the recipe. And you might want to look in the description. Sometimes there'll be a link in there that you can actually click on, and it'll show you more details on how to use a particular recipe. So that's a very quick overview of all these different panels in KitOps Synth. Okay, now let's go into a more detailed explanation of each one of these panels. In actions, as I mentioned before, if you click on an object, then this do it becomes available. Now, one of the issues that you're going to find is that there may be many objects in your scene, and you're going to find that you end up propagating the wrong object. I always like to take a look over here in my collections and make sure I have the right object highlighted when I hit do it, because many times I'm running in this mode here when I turn off the overlays, so I really don't know what's highlighted. So I look over here and I can figure that out. I'm going to quickly set something up, and we're going to talk about that here in just a minute, but let's go into inserts for this particular layer, and we'll use this, and let's say the placement style is going to be grid. Actually, let's use something a little simpler. Placement style is going to be grid, so it's 1-to-1. So, and then we tab into this. Remember, we have our side panel selected. And with that done, I'm going to hit do it, and you'll see that we have an object here. And so the clear button is going to be able to clear that, as we mentioned. So if we click the auto update, then what we can do is we can go in, and as we add another object, it's going to actually pop it in there. And this time we actually used a placement style of rows, which is 3 rows. So you can see we have quite a bit more stuff in here. If I click and change this to be something like this, then it'll do that. Let's take a look at that and see. You can see what we've got going. So auto update is very powerful, but you got to remember that sometimes you may be auto updating something with way too many polygons, and you're basically going to shut down Blender. It won't actually shut down, it'll probably just freeze. So be very careful about using auto update. So let's switch this to a cutter. And now we'll see that we have cutters. And I'm going to turn this off here, and you can see we have these different cutters that are lined up, and we have all of these modifiers that we generated for this particular object. With the object selected, I'm going to hit the preview button, and now you can see all the modifiers are gone. So it'll render a little bit faster when we're using preview. And again, turning it off is going to change it back to where it was. The other thing is that in this main seed, I can go ahead and click, and it's going to just move things around until I find something that I might like. Like for instance, I may say, I like what's going on here, and I might want to use that. Just gives you another option. In fact, if you look in the actual layer, we also have a seed value here as well. So I'll talk a little bit about what that means when we get down to the placement style. So that's about it for the actions panel. So next we'll talk about the iterator. I'm going to turn off auto update now. The iterator is pretty straightforward. It's just like if you were to keep clicking this arrow, incrementing the main seed by 1 with auto update on, and taking a picture. So let me show you what I mean. First, we're going to set the camera up properly in this scene. Okay, there we go. Now, I'm going to go into KitOps, make sure my smart mode's off. Typically, I turn off auto select insert, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay, so now I'm going to hit the F12 button just to show the render, and that's our rendering for this particular scene. Now that's done, what I want to do is I'm going to set up the iterator, and the way I do that is I'm going to choose the seed numbers. I want to go from 0, let's just do a quick one, to 10, and let's find a folder that we want to store them in. So I'll go to my downloads folder, and I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call this iterator test, and I'll double click on that, and I'll accept that. And now I'm going to open up the folder that we just created, and here it is. And what I'll do is we're doing 10 of these, and I have to make sure the box is selected, and I don't want auto update on here, and I'm going to hit the start button. And now I'm going to switch over to this folder, and you're going to start to see that I've got all these images being rendered. 2, 3. Now what if I want to stop it? Well, I can't really stop it from within Blender, but what I can do is just delete that ACK file, and once I've deleted it, it will stop. So it didn't get all the way to 10, it stopped at 8. And of course, if I look at this, I can see that each one of these is a different synth iteration. How cool is that? So if I say that I want number 6, for instance, I like number 6, I can go in here and just go back up to my actions and just type in 6 and say do it, and it'll give me 6. That was 6, there's 6. So that's how Iterator is used. And don't forget, you can delete that little ACK file if you ever want to stop Iterator, because there's no way to interrupt it from this panel when we're running iterations. And that's Iterator. Okay, so let's talk about the tools. Let's assume that we now have our object that we say is finished, and we're going to want to do some other things with it. Let's say we're going to want to make an insert out of it that we can place in other recipes, or we just want to simplify it. What I want to talk about now is these tools here that are used to help us do all of that. So bake object is basically the exact same thing in KitOps as convert to mesh. So what we're going to do with bake object is we're going to basically apply all these modifiers. It has a little bit of special magic to it, because applying all the modifiers sometimes doesn't quite work out as you might expect. So I always prefer using bake object. So I'll do that right now. So now I've baked the object. When I tab into this and I localize it, we'll see that we now have applied all of the modifiers to create the geometry you see there. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to remove unused wire inserts. So these inserts are used to create some of the geometry that we're looking at. And I'm going to hit this button and you'll see that now all of the wire inserts are gone. Remove wire inserts is also again available on KitOps. Remove unused wire inserts. Refresh KitOps Kpacks is great if you're actually creating your own recipes and you're building inserts as you go and dropping them in your Kpacks folders. And so you need to reset them. So this basically does that. It's the same thing as if you go over to KitOps and you hit this button right there. It will reload all of your other Kpacks. So reset synth settings will basically reset everything. And let me show you what I'm talking about. I click it. It puts everything back to its normal default state. If I accidentally click it, I can undo and get back to where I want to be. So those are the 4 tools for KitOps Synth. Okay, now let's talk about layers. We can think of the layers as synth propagation layers. And as we add new layers, synth will propagate from the first layer to the second layer to the third layer. So the question is, what is it that they propagate? Well, each layer has inserts, a placement style, transformation, and optimizations unique to it. The last one here, recipes, is a way to load all the layers at once, as well as save all the layers at once. And we'll get to that later. But keep in mind that layers represent the inserts, placement style, transformation, and optimizations for each different layer. So we can set up different inserts for each different layer. We can set up a placement style, a transformation, and an optimization independently for each layer. And that's a critical concept to understand. And of course, we propagate from the top layer to the next layer to the next layer. So let's take a look at that. We'll go ahead and select our object, and I'm going to select the top face. And on this, we'll use two layers. I'm going to call this one 1 and this one 2. This little indicator is our active layer. So of course, the checkbox says whether or not we're going to use it. So I'm going to turn off number 2, and I'm going to go into inserts. And I'm going to choose just a kind of a simple insert, this switch vertical. I will look at the placement style, which is how it's going to be placed in here. I've got it set to 3 rows. Let's just set it to a 1x1 grid. So that means it's going to insert this one time. Let's just go ahead and say do it. So that's how that layer worked. And notice it placed it directly on the surface of that face. Now I'm going to go ahead and clear that, and I'm going to tab into this, and I'll right click on it and I'll say subdivide, and over here let's just subdivide it maybe 3 times, and then let's select these surfaces. Notice that we've got 2 different contiguous surfaces, and if I hit do it, it's going to put a 1x1 grid over here and a 1x1 grid over here, and notice that it's basically the same switch setup in both places. So let's go ahead and tab back out, and let's just select this one surface here, and I'm going to say do it. Now notice what happened is I actually added another switch in here. And let's see, if I just Z this, you'll see that there's another switch in this space. And it didn't replace these others. And that's because layers understand and remember what their selection is. And you can have multiple selections for a different layer. And it's only going to clear and propagate based on the current selection. So if I want to actually get rid of this, I'll have to go back here, select this, tab out of it, and clear it. And this is going to leave what we did in the very last selection. And if I want, I can click on this button. This is going to basically select the last time that we propagated. And you can see there is the selection. So if we want to know what the last propagation selection is, it's this button right here. And if I change that propagation to something like this, and then say do it, I'm going to add to that. And if I want to clear these other ones, I'm going to have to go back into it, and I can clear this, but it's only going to clear those. So I'm going to have to go back in and select and remember, so I'm going to have to manually remember what happened here and clear it. So that's an important concept to understand. Let's look at what happens when we add a cutter to this. I'm going to go in here to this K-Pack and I'll go to S cutters. I will just use the default one and I'll say do it. This particular cutter has a surface that comes above and a surface that goes below. And that's because if we look at the modifiers for this cutter, we'll see that we have a difference modifier and we have a union modifier. And both the difference and union modifiers are still referred to as cutters in the KitOps world. So that means that if we were to apply these modifiers, this would be all one mesh. Let's go and look at the second layer. In this particular layer, remember that we still have this one face selected. I'm going to add on this one our switch vertical. Well, it's clear, and we'll do it. And now it's going to add all of these. So when you look at this, you're saying, wow, that's a lot of inserts. And yeah, it is. But it's actually not as many as you might think, because each one of these is a separate insert, right? So there's 3 rows, 1 row, 2 row, 3 rows of these inserts. So let's make them into a single grid. I'll click on hit this grid and we'll have a 1 row by 1 column. We'll do it again. When I pressed do it, it automatically deleted all of the other inserts it had propagated and replaced them with this one. The other thing of note is that when you press do it, you don't have to necessarily select the cube that we're working on, this box. You can select any insert of that cube and it will identify the target of that insert and it'll use that. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. So now, as we look at this, we see, just as before, this came in at the 0, 0 space, but is being included by this positive area over here. So how do we fix that? What if we want that to go up a little bit higher? Well, the way we do that is we're going to do that in a transformation, and we'll get to transformation in a second, but for right now, just understand that the Z position is always the position that's normal to the face that we're working on. So basically, if you were to say E extrude, that direction is what the Z position is. With that knowledge, let's go into the Z position and let's move it up positive 0.05. Let's just try that. Then we can say do it, and now it moves it up, and you can see that kind of works a little bit better. So if I'm building a recipe that I want to happen all in one press, then I can do that easily by adding multiple layers. And when I do this, I typically like to name them this way: 1, base, and then I'll call this one also 1 because I want it to operate at the same time. And that way I know when I see these 2 1s that I'll have these both selected. Because if I only select one, of course, it's just going to give us one thing. Or if I select the other one, it's going to give us the other thing. And I can select one and do it and select the other one and do it. But this, I know if I select them both together, I'm going to get all of these. And I might also want to create a layer and call this anything I want. I may just call this top. And I move this to the very top, and in here I'm going to turn it off. So that means that this layer is just referencing all the number 1s and tells what the 1s are, right? So if I sit there and say do it, this will work. If I put top on, do it, it's going to work because I have this turned off. It's a way of creating a hierarchy, if you will, of all the layers, because you may start here and do this, and then you may want to come in and say add, and we're going to say side, and we'll turn that off, and we'll say to base. Let's just go ahead and we'll use, let's use this control panel, and we'll make a grid 1 by 1. And now we have another set of layers, but I'm going to turn these off. And if I hit this and say do it, it's going to populate that up here, which is maybe not what I wanted. I may have wanted only the tops up here. Say do it. And then I tab into this and I click a side, and then I go to side and say do it. And so there's a side. So that's a way of creating a recipe that can be easily replicated. Now, the question is, how do you tell people how to do this? And that will come later, but I'll talk about recipes and how we actually augment recipes with a description and some instructions on how to use them. So let's talk a little more about some of these other things that you may want to be able to do. And one of them is this button right here. And that button will actually clear just that layer. It didn't clear all of these. And the other thing, this will actually reset a layer's settings as well. So notice that we have one object and we have it set to grid. If I go in here and hit this reset, now we're back to the default rows at 3 and the default object. So that resets. Of course, we can duplicate layers. And that's the duplicate button. And we can move them up and down, and that's pretty self-explanatory. The last thing I'll mention is that sometimes we may have multiple layers and they actually become part of a scrolling list, and you can just drag it down to make it a little bit larger. And so that's layers. Moving on, let's talk now about inserts. And if you're not familiar with inserts, inserts are basically special .blend files that are created using KitOps Pro. And in KitOps Pro, we can actually select an insert and then select an object and then add the insert, and it'll actually cut into the object in some cases, or in other cases, it's just going to lay on top of the object without cutting into it. Inserts can be scaled in a variety of different ways. And this is true for SYNTH as well. Let's delete these inserts and let's go into SYNTH and let's look at our inserts. So for each layer, SYNTH can propagate that layer, which means take the inserts that are assigned to that layer and arrange them in a placement style. And we have up to 7 slots that we can store inserts in. So let's talk about this. I'm going to go in here and let's stretch this out a little bit. So let's tab into this and select the top surface. And that's the face that we're going to be propagating with. And then let's find the scaled inserts. I'll tell you about why we choose that here in just a second. Because we have 7 different inserts we can use to propagate this with, I'm going to click this button right here, and it's going to set all the kpacks for all the inserts in this layer to as scaled. And that means I can just go in here and I can choose to turn them on and find a different insert. So I'll take a red button and let's do a knob. And let's do one more. We'll choose something like this button here. So now we have 4 of the 7 that we're going to use to propagate. And I can just go down here and say the placement style, we're going to use a grid, and I want to use 1 row and 4 columns. And I'll select the object and say do it. And there they are, 1, 2, 3, 4. It shows 3 of these and 1 of those. Didn't choose any of these or any of these or any of these. So if I want to debug this, I can just turn all these off, right? And say do it, and now I'll get all 4 of them. Now notice that I get all 4 except this one didn't cut a hole. Why is that? Well, we'll talk about it later, but basically we'll need to turn on our exact optimization in our booleans, and then it'll work correctly. And that's the new 2.91 exact boolean feature. So we've debugged that, so we know that that works. I can put auto update on, and we can check for each one of these to make sure that they all work correctly. So, and I think we're in pretty good shape. So what's going on here? Let's talk about this. Well, first off, notice that these all have these squares that say proportional. And when we turn off proportional, it will stretch our insert to its bounds, right? Another thing to notice here is that I can also just click on this main seed and I can use that to render different versions of this. Here's one that has all 4 versions. So we'll leave that like there, number 16. Now, what if I just want to force it to be all 4 versions and not have to step through this at one time, one after the other after the other? Well, that's easy. We come down here to this little thing and say use once. So when we click on use once, it's going to use each insert one time. And now as I step through this, you'll see they all are being equally represented in the propagation. Now, another thing we can do is we can also bring the inserts in at the correct scale. And since these are part of the S scaled, it means that they were actually created with a scale in mind. And when I do that, let's go ahead and click on one. You'll see how small that is, because this is a huge 4 meters, right? So let's go ahead and let's do that for all of them. And then let's scale this down. Let's scale it way down, something like this. And let's say do it. And now we can see that these are the correct scale. Now, if I want to populate these more, I can of course go into grid and I can change the rows to 2, and it'll do that. But remember, since we only have 1 apiece, we're only going to be propagating them with 1 each. So in this case, I might want to turn this off. Okay, so the last thing I want to discuss about the inserts is this scale and cover. I'm going to come in here, select our object, and we're going to move it out a little bit, tab into it, select the top face. And with this cutter selected, as you can see, we have this boundary 02 cutter selected. I'll hit do it. And now I've created a placement style of 3 rows, and I've cut into the surface, and they're all set to 100%. If I turn this off and put in auto update, we'll see that now it's actually added 2 columns and 3 rows. And we're going to talk a little bit more about placement style here in a minute. But if I want them to go even larger, I can go into scale and say 105%. And now it's cutting completely through. Now it's not working correctly because we need to go into our optimizations and hit exact, but it has there. So now we've basically increased the size of this to 105%, and we're getting some more unique kinds of cutters. And so the other thing to talk about is cover. And cover is pretty straightforward. I got this little example set up. I've got a couple different switches in my inserts, and I have a grid of 8 by 8. So when I hit do it, I'm going to end up generating 64 different switches in columns and rows 8 by 8. And you can see it's roughly 50-50 is their propagation. And if I go into the red and I just say, okay, let's give that a 20% cover and say do it again, it's going to reduce the number of red switches in the propagation roughly to a 20 by 80 percentage. And that's really what cover does for us in this area. And then of course, frequency down below, as we mentioned, is how much overall. So this is representing 20% of the overall surface. And this red button is now 20% of all the propagations on the surface. So really that's about it for understanding how inserts work. They're pretty straightforward. Okay, now let's talk about the placement style panel. And this is the main engine of SYNTH. If you think about it, this is what controls where the inserts go on the faces that you've selected. And really quickly, we have a seed value. So it's very much like this seed, except it only works within this particular layer. And then we have rows, columns, grid, edge, and random. So we have these are the basic 5 different ways that you can place inserts onto the object. But even with that, there's some other things that you can do. Like in rows, you can actually place things on the boundary of rows. And of course, we have these variations that you can deal with in the frequency. And we're going to talk all about that. So let's get started. So placement style defaults to rows with 3 columns. I'm going to stretch this out in the X direction a little bit so we can identify the difference between rows and columns. And let's go into our inserts panel. I'll choose the S scaled K-Pack, and I'll choose just something easy for us to understand. We'll take this red button and then we'll propagate all the K-Packs, and then we'll go ahead and we'll grab another button, this LED on button. So this is going to be easy. And I'm going to leave these set to proportional for now. Now that I've done this, let's tab into our object, select the top surface and hit the do it button. And we'll see that we have 3 different rows that are populated. We didn't tell how many columns to use, so I'm going to change this one up into like something like a main knob, and let's do it again. And now we can see that we have again 3 rows, but notice in top view they aren't lined up in a grid. They are actually all squeezed together as close as they can in the rows. And let's add one more while we're at it, and we'll go in here, and this one we're going to add this thing called Space Golden, and I'll hit do it. So now what I've done is I've actually created spaces in my propagation strategy here for this rows. So I can use a space insert to generate blank areas if I want. And if I turn maintain aspect ratio off, I'm going to get an even different solution, because some of these are going to be square. It's going to try its best to fill up completely. And of course, I hit the auto update, and I can go now into this seed value, and I can just start clicking, and it'll generate different versions for me. Now, the other thing I can do is notice that all of these 3 rows are the same height. So I'm going to basically change the row variation to something like 40. And now look, we have different variations here. I can also adjust the width variation, and it'll also add in a randomness width factor as well. And lastly, I can do something with frequency and say 20. And that now only populates these items into 20%. And let's actually turn off the Space Golden so we can see what we're talking about. So now we're only covering 20% of the overall surface. So now what happens if I basically go in here and I say don't scale this object? Now what's going to happen is look how many of these it's generating, quite a bit. So I'm going to actually now take this and scale it quite a bit down, hit the period key on the numpad to zoom up on it, and do it again, and you'll see now that's not scaling the object. That's where these come into play, top, medium, and bottom. If I click the top, you'll see that we're going to move this switch to the top. If I hit the middle and the bottom, so I can actually, within a row, I can position items differently. Let's go ahead and move the frequency up to 100 again, and you'll see what's going on. Now this knob isn't set to don't scale, so if we do that, you'll see that we have the same thing. They're all at the bottom now they're at the middle, and now they're at the top. So that's going to be something that's useful in creating different kinds of patterns. So there's one troubleshooting issue that you need to know about when it comes to rows and columns for that matter. And I've set up this very simple example to show you. It's just kind of a long tall cube. And if I go in here, you notice that I've got don't scale on. So this cube is pretty much set up to the same size as this switch, except it's longer. If I turn don't scale off, and I'm using rows, and I've got one row, I turn it off and then select the object and say do it. I'm going to get this message, no inserts were fit. Check setup. No inserts were added. And you might wonder, well, why did it work with scale on? This is just saying, fit it, right? If I turn this off and do it, I'm going to get a stretch. But when I go back into proportional editing, let's turn auto update on, you'll see it doesn't work. And if I go into the don't scale, it will work. And that's because don't scale pretty much tries to force its way onto the actual surface in rows and columns. But you may find in the case of proportional editing, you're going to have that problem. So the best thing to do in this particular case is just adjust the scale to something maybe like 95% or 50%. You can figure it out, just move your way up. If you run into that particular error, no inserts were fit, then try adjusting the scale some and you'll see that you'll get those inserts to fit. Okay, so we've covered everything but this use boundary feature in the rows, and let's show you what that does. I'm going to go ahead and stretch this out, tab into it, select the face, and then let's go in and add some cutters. I'll grab this one and copy all the KPAC settings so I can grab another one, and the other one I'll grab is just going to be this golden age panel. That's fine. And I'm going to turn these off so that they can be filled up in the whole thing, and I'll just say do it, and see we've got a very nice little setup. I got this hole here. Why is that there? That's because we haven't turned on our optimizations yet. So let's turn that on and do it, and now we're good. What I want to do is I want to actually put detail in the boundaries. And if you followed any of my design patterns tweets or any of the notes I posted on my Patreon about design patterns, you'll know that boundary detail is important to creating nice design. So what we can do is with this, I'm going to call this base layer. We'll just call it base. And I'm going to just duplicate that. And then I'm going to go in here and call it boundary. And let's turn this one off. Let's grab something like this little border blivet right here. And I'll go in and I'm going to say use boundary. And I'm going to leave the rest of the settings exactly the same. But the difference is I'm going to scale this way down, maybe like 10%. And I'm going to set the cover to maybe like 20%. And now when I select my object and say do it, we'll see that we have these little items that show up in the border. I really want them to be proportional. Let's do it again. Here we go. So now we're starting to see these items in the border. I might make them 20%, make them a little bit larger. And you can see they work out quite well. And I can just start in here in my seed, turn on auto update, and just start adjusting them. If I want to see what they look like. 1, 2, maybe I want to change the frequency to something like 40. That's going to put more of them in there so you can kind of see what happens. Anyway, that's the whole point of the use boundary feature inside of rows. So basically column placement is almost exactly the same as rows with just a couple little minor changes. Let's turn off our boundary and let's go back into base and let's just set that to the default columns, and you'll see that it renders them like that. And if we go and now we turn on boundaries and we change those to columns, you'll see what happens is that all of these boundary details are facing the wrong way because that's the way that they were modeled. And so the way to fix that is we go into transformation, and we're going to have a whole section on transformation. But what we'll do is we'll just rotate them 90 degrees. And when we do that, you'll see that this works out a little better. But what happens is they quickly overlap each other. And so in this particular case, what I'm going to do, instead of 40%, I'm going to make it 15%. And we'll see that we don't have as much of a problem there. And there we have it. And again, as we mentioned earlier, we can just go into the seed value and keep changing it as we wish. Now, one other last thing about columns is a lot of designs may prefer columns, especially wall designs, because in column design, it's a little more difficult to identify patterns. Now we're talking about the grid placement style. And as you can see here, we have it selected. You have rows and you have columns, and you can edit the number of rows and columns. I'm going to change this to 2. You can see that it just changed our grid model to 2 rows and 4 columns. I've got just a golden H panel in my S cutters that I'm using, so I can zoom in on it. You can see that it's got a cutter that goes in with these little edit details out of the top. By the way, if you notice it's a golden H, if I go in here and switch it to a golden V, now these little squares are going to be more square, so that's what that's for. I can also click this button, which is going to make sure that it stays proportional, as you recall. And when I do that and hit the Do It button, those will stay proportional. And now I can actually use these features. For instance, I can say, let's make sure that these are set to the top of all of the rows or to the bottom. Right now, we don't have something in the center right because we're not doing anything with that. If we had a small to scale object like a switch, then we could see how that works. So let's go ahead and do that. Turn off auto update, go to one of our scaled objects. I'm going to take just this red switch, and now I'll go back in and say do it, and you'll see that it fills it up. Now I'm going to go ahead and make it the actual correct scale. And now, as you can see, if I make this, now you can see if I make them left or right, they'll actually move over that way. Of course, you can use seed value to move things around. And we can actually adjust the column variation as well. So let's take a look at and see how we would do that. So by adjusting the column variation to something like 40, you see that it adjusts quite nicely a variety of different column widths. And again, I can use the seed value to change that as well. And the same thing's true with the row variation. So that's really the grid placement style. Let's talk about the edge placement style. So first off, I have a layer here that's set up with a couple different cutters in there. Everything looks about right. I'm going to just leave it the way it is. And then what I'll do is I'm going to add another layer, and I'm going to call this our edge layer. I'll go down here and I'll select edge. First, I'll add this same border blivet that we've added before, and I'm going to call this edge X. I'll tell you why in a second. And now with edge set, I am going to scale this maybe 5%, and I want the frequency to be maybe 20 with our object selected. Let's do it. And you can see what has happened now is all around the border we're getting this blivet insert added. Let's make it 10%. Put auto update on. Okay, so now again it's working, but the problem is on this side of the border the orientation is off, as you can tell. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say X only, and when I do that, now it's only going to be shown on this side of the border. And you can see that we have one here, but it's not working properly. Why is that? Well, again, let's just go into our optimizations and let's hit exact. And there it comes in. So now we put a couple little inserts on the border, and what we're going to want to do is move them in. So I'm going to change this offset setting to something like 0.1. And wow, that moved them in quite a bit. You can see up here. So let's do something a little bit smaller than that. And we'll make the offset 0.03. There you go. So we're close. Something like 0.05 there. So that works pretty good. And I only have one blivet, so I might add up the frequency to 30. There we go. So now we have a few more in there. And then what I'll do is I'm going to turn off auto update. I'm going to take this selected and I'm going to duplicate it. And I'm going to go down in here and I am going to change this from X only to Y only. And let's go ahead and put auto update on, and we'll press do it. And you'll see that now we have these on the Y, but they're rotated the wrong direction. So we'll go down the transformation and we rotate them 90. So we might want to change this to 0.03. And there we have the edge detail around the border of our object. And that's pretty much how edge works. So one thing I should mention is that this is still a KitOps object, right? And I can go in here and I can grab an insert like this insert right here, for instance, and I can move it around. It's actually doing a pretty large Boolean modifier move when I do that. Let's take a look at this object, for instance. And you can see, look at all the actual Boolean modifiers. And keep in mind that they are also using the exact Boolean mode, which is pretty heavy. I can basically turn these off by saying viewport viz like this, and then I can just select these and I can move them around. So if I want to center these or do whatever I want to, or if one's hanging off the edge and I don't want it, I can move them around. And as long as I don't repropagate, I'm going to be in good shape. So I'll go back in here and say turn these back on. It'll take a little while, but it comes in fine. So just thought I'd mention that. So the last placement generator is just random. And it's pretty straightforward. And this number, the amount, is actually the number of instances that you're going to generate on top of here. Each one of these objects can be turned to scale or on or off, but it really doesn't affect anything. Neither does this button, the don't scale button, affect anything because they all come in at the proper scale. And if you want to adjust the scale, just use the scale number up here. And then you can play around with these scale plus and minuses if you want to move around a little bit, but it's not a whole lot you can do. Again, it's there because there might be some use for some random placement. Let's talk about the transformation panel. So what I've got set up here is a default cube with a couple different inserts. And as you can see, they're just using the default settings. And I've got this padding of 0.1, and let's take a look at that. So if I zoom all the way up, you can see I've got this little tiny rim across there. Now I can also take that padding and make it 0, and then select my object and say do it. I've gotten rid of that rim. Let's add one more to the mix. So after adding this one, we see we have a hole over here that we have created. The way to fix that typically is you go into the exact mode, and that will generally fix it. Although, again, if we look at our object, we're going to see that we have another hole. So that 0% padding isn't really doing the job for us. So I might want to go minus 0.05, and that'll fix it. So that's something that I use padding for a lot, is to fix booleans. Use exact first. That doesn't work, then I'll mess with the padding. Now the other thing that I want to talk about is this concept of Z position. Z position is looking at how deep we're placing the object. Now right now it's at 0, but if I say 0.1, I'm lifting it up, and if I say minus 0.1, I'm cutting them down in, and you can see we've already got a little bit of a problem there. I might go in here and mess with my padding. Let's try 1, and that seems to fix it. So anyway, that's how the Z position works. Now, let's also talk about some of the scale, and I'm going to basically go into wireframe to show you some of that. So when we look at these objects, we'll see that a scale in the Z direction at 0 is just the normal height. Think of that as 100% height. And if we add another 50% height, it's going to grow it by half. And if I add 100% height, it's going to double it. Similarly, if I go minus 50, it's going to make it half as tall. So all of these work pretty much the same way, right? So we go in here and we can say scale X, and we can say minus 50, and it's going to scale everything in the X dimension half a size. Now another thing to watch for is this rotation numbers. Let's type 90 in here, and when we do that, you'll see that a lot of these aren't behaving like we might expect them to with the padding anymore, because once you rotate them, SYNTH does not use the rotated bounding calculation for the propagation algorithm. So when you do rotate things, they may run into each other. That's the key takeaway from that. Now the other thing is the rotate offset. So I can actually type in some number in here, and it will actually randomize around those 33 degrees. And if I type in 90, it'll do the same thing. It's going to randomize around there, and that's a great way for adding lots of interesting detail. The optimized panel is pretty straightforward also. It just tells you whether to use fast or exact booleans. So remember that exact booleans are only available in 2.91 and greater. So let me show you what I'm talking about. I've got two inserts here. I'm going to hit the do it button, and you can see that these are not working out. Their inserts aren't correct. If I look at my transformations, because I have a 0% padding. And if I go into my modifiers, you'll see that every one of these differences and unions are set to fast. And if I walked through these and set everyone to exact, I would get this. And now they're set to exact. I do have a couple little issues. And as I mentioned earlier, is I do see any issues. I'm going to just go into the transformation padding size, and I might go minus 0.1, and that'll help me get around all of this. So, and that typically helps me fix it, because what I want is I really do want a manifold object at the end of the day so that I can continue to keep adding and subtracting booleans from it. Okay, the last thing to talk about here is the recipes panel, and in there are 3 items: load recipe, save recipe, and enter descriptions. So if you want to, you can save all your layers and all the insert references, as well as all the placement, styles, transformations, and optimization settings in a JSON recipe, and that's very simple. You can enter a description about what it is that your recipe does, and then you hit the save recipe button. You can enter in a name, and it is always followed by the .json, and that's how you save a recipe. And then if you want to load a recipe, we'll go in and we will load, for instance, the corridor recipe. And notice that we have a click link here. So if you enter in a URL in here, this will actually just allow you to click this link. And in this case, it's going to take you to this tutorial where it's going to walk you through how to use the corridor recipe. And of course, once you have a recipe loaded, it's a simple matter just to select a face and just hit the button that says do it. Now you've basically propagated your object with all the items in the recipe. So that covers it for the video manual.